Hello, everybody. Okay, so here we are at class number 9 of neuropsychology. And tonight we're going to be talking about a number of different things. What I wanted to start talking about tonight, we're going to get into some other areas of neuropsychological disorders. But what I wanted to um, cover tonight to start with is some of the major areas of cognitive functioning. So when we talk about neuropsychological disorders, we talk about different areas being impacted. But what I wanted to talk about tonight was what are some of those areas? What are the major neuropsychological areas of neuropsychological functioning? So I wanted to start by talking about those tonight. So I will pull this up here. Give me 1 second. Okay. And we will start with some slides that I have obtained about the higher areas of cognitive functioning. So again, when we talk about cognitive functioning, um, what are the main areas of cognitive functioning? So I'm going to talk about some of the major areas. So when we talk about impairment and neuropsychological disorders, we can address the question, well, what actually is being impaired? So you see here, so some of the areas that we're talking about that are being impaired start with learning and memory. Learning is considered the brain changes, the neural mechanisms by which an individual changes behavior on the basis of past experience. So learning is all about taking on new information or that leads to some sort of change in behavior. So an experience leads to um, neurological changes, and that neurological changes leads to future changes in behaviors. Memory is the acquisition, storage, and retrieval of sensory information. So information comes in, and memory is when that information is stored, but it can't just be stored. The person has to be able to retrieve it. When you're talking about these two things, there's a couple things I want you to keep in mind. That when we talk about learning, notice how one of the parts of the definition of learning is it has to lead to some sort of change in behavior. So it can't just be that learning results in some sort of change in the brain and how it's functioning, but learning has to impact on the person's behavior. Now, that change in behavior could be as simple as um, if a child learns who won the Civil War, the change of behavior could be that in the future, when they are asked who won the Civil War, they have a correct answer to give. So that could be the change in behavior. Or the change in behavior could be something that happens in therapy where the person learns better anger management skills. So in the future, when they get angry, their behavior is different than it has been in the past. Memory is the ability to not only store information, but retrieve it. So that's why, for instance, with ADHD, um, individuals with ADHD often seem like they have um, poor recall. So sometimes it can be difficult when you're assessing someone who may have ADHD to determine whether what they have is ADHD or memory problems. And the reason for that is because many individuals with ADHD have problems with memory. Again, the reason being that if you never take in the information, if you never store it, then you're not able to retrieve it. So these two things are related. Storage and retrieval are related because if you cannot, if you didn't store it in the first place, which often would be a problem with attention, you can't retrieve it. So memory isn't just storage of information. Um, Memory is both storage and retrieval of information. Now, there are different types of learning. Reflex learning is associated with immediate behavior change, and incidental learning is the person gets information from sensory inputs and develops the potential to behave differently. So a child may learn who won the Civil War, and they have the potential to answer in the future if, when asked the question, to give the correct answer, but they may choose not to. And so that would mean that they have the potential to behave differently. They just don't behave differently. So what I want you to see here is you're seeing how sometimes when we talk as we go on here about different types of neuropsychological disorders, you're starting to see here how there can be crossovers, specifically talking about kids. Because notice here, let me go back here. Like I said here, an individual with, say, ADHD may never take in the information in the first place. So it may seem like they have the inability to recall information. So it may seem like they have memory problems. But if their problems are really with attention, then that problem is only in the storage part of learning something, of recalling something. But memory, saying that you have a memory problem, relates to the storage and retrieval. Now, also, when you talk about a child who has some sort of oppositional behavior problems, uh, it may be that they have learned something, which means they have the potential to act differently. They have developed the potential to behave differently, meaning they have the potential to answer a question correctly when asked. They just choose not to. Other types of this is particularly problem. This is particularly important in psychological research. Non-associated, the person learns about properties of a single stimulus when repeatedly exposed to the same stimulus. In associative learning, person learns about relationship between two stimuli or a stimulus and a behavior. So here this would be like with Pavlov's dog, where the dog eventually learned that the ringing of the bell repeated, after repeated attempts, the dog learned that food was coming whenever the dog would hear the bell. And that's why the dog eventually started to salivate. This is associated more with Skinnerian learning, stimulus and behavior. This is a big part of psychotherapy. Because often what happens especially in behavior therapy, is you find that the person has learned that when something happens, they behave a certain way. And so what often will happen in behavior therapy is what you're trying to do is get the person to uh, develop a different behavior to the same stimulus. So non-associative learning is more with things like Pavlov dog. Associative learning is more with what behavior therapy is looking at. Habituation, decrease in response to a stimulus when that stimulus is presented repeatedly. So what that means is that over time, as the person gets exposed more and more to the same stimulus, they may not respond so strongly. It becomes habitual. And then the opposite of it is sensitization. So the person reduces the amount of response they give to the stimulus. Here, the person gives more of a response to a certain stimulus. Here we go with the habituation. First time the first time the stimulus is presented, you get a novel response. And then, but the more it's repeated over and over again, you get less of a response. And eventually, the person may not even respond, or the individual may not even respond to the stimulus. Again, this new clock in the room that, when it's there, you may pay attention to it. And after a while, you may not even notice it at all. This is just a little bit about the what happens neurologically. This is the chemical that's often associated with learning. But really what you have here is just the general sense of what happens in habituation, is that with repeated stimulus, there is less neurotransmitter released over time. So the more the person gets exposed to the stimulus, the less of the neurotransmitter gets released. And then on the opposite end, the increase in the neurotransmitter gets released. So all I really wanted you to see here is this whole idea again of the amount of neurotransmitter that's released when the individual is exposed to a stimulus is what most often leads to the whether there is habituation or sensitization in the person responding to the stimulus. Sensitization, and this is the neurotransmitter that's most often associated with learning is serotonin. I'll just skip over. I wanted you notice here that you have just the different types of learning here. I'm going to skip over some of these things because I really just wanted to get to So I wanted to get to the different types of memory here. Implicit memory, explicit memory, short-term memory, intermediate long-term memory, and long-term memory. So let's talk about the different types of memory. Notice here, this is the thing. Notice how here what we have are the conscious memory and the non-conscious memory. This is explicit and implicit memories. And the conscious one can be facts and general knowledge or personally experienced event, and some of the non-conscious can be learning different types of motor and cognitive skills and objects and words. So on the non-conscious level, there's different types of these can be skills, they can be words, these can be facts, these can be experiences that are all either part of things that we do or things that we have said or heard said to us. Implicit memory, notice here, the implicit memory, the more conscious memory, how to perform something, and explicit, notice how we go back here, implicit and explicit memory. This is often how to do things. And remember what we talked about before with the issue of memory, that what you get with the non-conscious memory is often sort of a response that may not even be conscious. The person may not even be aware of the response that they developed. And then the explicit memory is more factual information. So how we do things, how we respond is stored in the implicit memory. And notice how, so when we go back here and we talked about the implicit, notice that things that are said to us may be part of the non-conscious memory, but so may our response to things, the non-verbal response that we learn to about things ends up all being part of implicit non-conscious memory. So there's explicit memory, which is conscious, implicit memory that is non-conscious. And notice here that the explicit, the conscious memory is associated with the hippocampus. The implicit memory is not associated with the hippocampus. And notice when we talk about the implicit memory here, it motor skills, habits, behavioral reflexes, and learning procedures and rules. So learning how we are to respond to things, which can be buried in our non-conscious part of our brain. Our non-conscious memory can be memories about how we've learned to respond to danger, traumatic events, upsetting situations, challenging situations. And so this is where you see how the non-conscious plays a role in how people function, because the learning of how to respond to challenging situations is in an area of the brain that often is not accessed consciously. And notice these are some of the areas in implicit memory: the neocortex, the amygdala. Notice here so when we talk about the non-conscious memory, it's often associated with skills and habit in the more basic part of the brain, the basal ganglia, But as we get to some of the other areas, in particular, the emotional response. So the non-conscious memory is connected right up here with the amygdala, and the non-conscious memory. Explicit memory is factual knowledge associated with what, and notice that the so here the areas of the brain that are associated with the non-conscious, the neocortex, the cerebellum, but in particular, notice how this non-conscious memory connects up with the amygdala. And then when we go to the explicit memory, it's the hippocampus and the temporal lobe. But the explicit memory is more the conscious memory more in the hippocampus, the non-conscious memory in these different areas, but in particular for psychotherapy, the amygdala. We'll just skip over. So I wanted to also talk with you about how when we talk about memory, the explicit, the conscious memory can be split into short-term memory, intermediate long-term, and long-term memory. Short-term memory is stored in a different area of long-term. In fact, it's stored in an area of the brain. It's stored in areas of the brain where it's kind of on hold. So there's this area, I forget if it's on the next slide. Let me just check this out here. I don't think so. Okay. Let me see if it's on the next one. Okay, so so the thing about short-term memory, short-term memory, it's not shown here, but short-term memory can also be split. Short-term memory can be split into what is called working memory and recent memory. Working memory is stored in an area of the brain where it's on hold until it can be consolidated. So before memory gets consolidated so it can be returned later or retrieved later, it's in an area of the brain called working memory. And working memory is memory that may not even get consolidated for long-term storage. It may just be in an area of brain where it's being held just for the immediate time so the person can use it. So there's that, and then there's working memory, which is memory that's not even being stored for retrieval. Recent memory, which is usually a few minutes, and then it's over to intermediate long-term and then long-term memory. And these are just different. So notice that these are some of the areas of the brain that they're just different areas of the brain that that everything runs through. So it starts here in the frontal, temporal, and parietal lobes, where it's kind of where the information is taken in, and then it goes through different parts of the cortex, and then another part of the cortex, and then usually stored somewhere in the hippocampus for factual information. Okay, and we've already gone through this. Okay, and then there's working memory. And so the different parts of working memory that that is important is attention. So working memory is material that you're actively paying attention to at the time. So here are the parts of working memory that it operates over a few seconds. It's in a temporary storage area of the brain. It's usually much more active. Usually when memory is stored in the hippocampus, it's not manipulated. It has to be brought out into working memory before it can be manipulated. So working memory can go two ways. It can either be where memory is stored while it's coming in before it's been processed, so it can be actively manipulated, or it can be where the memory is brought out into, so the person can manipulate it at the time. So if, for instance, you are learning that 3 times 5 is 15, as that information is coming in, it's probably during a math class. And if it's during a math class, then you're wanting to keep it in working memory because you'll probably want to make use of it during the class. And then it sort of passes through into the longer term memory areas. And then when you pull it back out, it goes back into working memory so that you can manipulate it. So here's, like I said, here's the aspects of working memory. It's the ability to temporarily hold and manipulate information for cognitive tasks performed in daily life. Holds information for a few seconds, is temporary. This is an important thing to keep in mind. Working memory can hold 5 to 7 items at a time. So really working memory has a very limited capacity. Like I said, it's 5 to 7 items at any one time. It's where you hold information so you can work on it and manipulate it. And attention plays a major role in working memory. So this is another, and these are some of the areas of the brain that are particularly associated with working memory. I'm gonna kind of skip over them. And there's another. So just a couple things to keep in mind about where memory, and this is why I wanted to go through this. Amnesia. So some of the things, some of the disorders that we see, some of the memory disorders we see when we're talking about neuropsychological disorders include amnesia, like we talked about last time, Alzheimer's disease, and senile dementia. So the other types of dementia. The prefrontal cortex, that's where the working memory. So the very front of the brain, some things that are involved there is the working memory and the episodic memory that we talked about. Okay, let me just stop that. Okay, so okay, now I'm going to move on to another set of slides that I have here that I want to talk about. So it's the question of what is attention. So what I talked about there in the previous set of slide was what is memory, and some of the main things we talked about there were, you know, that there's the implicit and the explicit, and we've talked about that, which is why we talked about retrograde amnesia and anterograde amnesia. We talked about working memory, recent memory, uh, middle, long-term memory, and then long-term memory. By the way, long-term memory, the middle long-term memory is also called remote memory. And then long-term memory. Long-term memory is kind of when it's in either the hippocampus or the parts of the brain associated with implicit memory. We talked about how working memory has 5 to 7 items. It's either when the information is coming in and you manipulate it, or when it's going out and you manipulate it. We talked about what the difference between learning and memory. So what I wanted to talk about next is what is attention. because with a lot of neuropsychological disorders, we talk about the impairment of attention. And by the way, a lot of these slides are neurology slides that I have. So I'm kind of skipping over parts because I'm skipping over the neurological parts and focusing mainly on the neuropsychological parts. But I wanted to talk about attention. Um, um, Attention is when we focus on some information that we expect that we will need for further processing. Attention is the taking possession by the mind of what seems well, this is an older definition of it, but it's one that's still in use. Notice just some different parts. This is an older definition, but notice how it still has parts that we use today. Taking possession. Oh, I'm sorry. Hold on a second. Taking possession by the mind in clear and vivid form of one of what seems several simultaneously possible objects. So basically, it's focusing on something in clear and vivid form in a clear way of what seems to be a number of different pieces of information that you can focus on. So if you think about what attention is, if you think about it, there are millions, if not billions of different things that you could focus on. Well, maybe not millions of, but many different things that you could focus on at any one time. And attention is where you choose to put your focus when things are going on around you. And notice, so like I said, there's different, like it says here on the slides, there are different types of attention. There is selective, sustained, and divided. Selected, it's when people focus on information that is related to their goals. Sustained, sustained is where you keep your attention on something in order to get to the goal. And divided is when instead of focusing mainly on one thing, you focus on more than one thing at a time. So there are different types of attention. There is selective, where you just focus on one thing. There is sustained, where you keep focused on one thing in order to get to your goal, and divided, where you actually focus on two or more different things at any one time. Now, notice how whether it's divided or selective, you want it to be sustained. Selective can be selective in terms of space. So you're focusing on only one location. So selective in terms of space, focus on one location. It can be selective in terms of time. So that a bunch of information coming at you one after another, you may just keep your focus on something that was presented a little bit ago, and that may be what you're storing in working memory. So oftentimes attention and working memory go together because you may be putting something in working memory, and that's what you're choosing to attend to at the time. We'll just skip over this. It's just about an experiment. This is some interesting things about that these are some things about selective attention. We attend to and process only a fraction of what we see. So people end up being more focused and more likely to tend to material that is of central interest to them. So the more important, this may be commonsensical, but the more important something is, the more likely it is that the person will pay attention. The more integral the information is towards the person reaching their goals, the more likely it is that they're going to pay attention to it. And so in that way, it is what attention is what is called top down, meaning that the things that are most important are what we pay the most attention to. Um, uh, and saying that something is important means that it directs us towards towards our goals. They can be integral in terms of us teaching, in terms of us reaching our goals. And in that context, I wanted to bring this up. Endogenous attention is internally controlled. This would be a good example of how we tend to give the most attention to something that is driven by our goals, that helps us meet our goals. So it's now this came up. It's interesting in this slide that the question this comes up because of this question: is it always selective and voluntary? And the evidence is that it's not. It's not. It's attention is not voluntary. We may get in the habit of automatically focusing on aspects of our environment that will help us reach our immediate goals. So attention is not always something that's voluntary. And that's why sometimes with individuals who have ADHD, what you need to do is help them to be more conscious of where they're putting their attention. So you almost make attention more voluntary because the person isn't paying attention very well on their own. Their attention may not automatically be going where it needs to go in order to help them reach their goals. So what you often do with attention is work with them to get in a better habit of putting their attention on things that are likely to help them reach their goals. I'm just skipping over a whole bunch of these things. I wanted to get to this part. So there are this where what I just went through is an experiment that led to this, that there are three different aspects of attention. I talked before about there being three different types of attention, but there are three different aspects of attention. So arousal, which is in the subcortical areas, that's where the brain is alerted that something needs paid attention to. The sort of initial attention, the spatial attention to the immediate environment is based in the parietal lobes. And then that longer term attention is based in the frontal lobe. So notice how attention, like so many things in the brain, if you picture where these different areas are, subcortical, meaning down around the basal ganglia, brainstem, where the stuff comes in, then moving up through the parietal lobes. So sort of you can almost picture if you picture I don't have a picture of the brain, but you can picture it coming up through the subcortical areas up here, if you picture where the parietal lobes are, and then heading forward towards the brain. That's so that's what you've got there. You've got you've got it starting in the arousal area where it comes up through the top, and then going through the parietal lobe and then coming out towards the front. And that's how the attention gets started. gets triggered, gets started, triggered, started, and then sustained. Again, notice how so many things in the brain go back forward, bottom up, so to speak. Okay, and I wanted to these are just different experiments here. So exogenous, I wanted to talk about exogenous and endogenous attention. Are when we want to examine a stimulus in more detail, our eyes move and focus on that object. This permit the image of the stimulus to fall in that part with the greatest acuity. And so this is how it all, when something is of something that we want to pay attention to visually, we move our eyes on that object, and that goes into the area of the retina with the greatest acuity. And then what happens is this is how the eyes sort of target onto something that we want to pay attention to. I don't want to go through all this. Let me just get, so basically what this is all talking about, these are just different experiments, but attention shifts can occur covertly without any change in eye position. So people can be trained on how to focus their eyes so that they're not even having to change their eye position, but they can, even if they're not changing their eye position, they can shift where they put their attention. I don't want to go into basically what all this is about. What I'm saying with this is that you can train a person where to focus their attention. A lot of therapeutic techniques for ADHD, for trauma, are related to this idea of being able to focus your attention on certain things without even having to move your eyes. People can be trained on where to focus their attention. So I wanted to talk about the parietal lobe and how damage to the parietal lobe can cause patients to overlook sensory information, and this is called visual neglect. So lesions in the parietal lobe can cause people to overlook, to not pay attention to things. And notice how before we brought up how the parietal lobe is part of this whole processing pathway in the brain when it comes to attention. And these are some pictures of people who were experiencing neglect. Notice what happened. This is all visual neglect here. Notice how clearly part of the clock is missing and part of the flower is missing. That's visual neglect. So this is all about how so when individuals have damage to the parietal areas, they often have difficulty with attention to different parts of their environment. Okay, and then when attention is directed towards an object, all parts of that object are selected for. So when a person is looking at an object, all the different parts of that object could be part of what goes in. And then where the person, so attention is this complex process where all different aspects of what the person is looking at could be taken in, but it is where the person then further focuses their gaze. This is visual, focuses their gaze, is what controls what it is that they pay attention to. Okay, so that was all about. Okay, I skipped ahead a couple slides here because I wanted to, basically the things that we were talking about before are a bunch of experiments that talked about why people pay attention to what they pay attention to. And there's a lot of evidence that training where the person gaze or what they do with their eyes can manipulate, can change where they put their attention. I don't want to go through all that. It's certainly fascinating stuff. It's the basis of not only some training that people do with that practitioners do with ADHD, but also what practitioners do with trauma. So it it's fascinating stuff, but I don't want to delve too much into it because there's a lot of detail. What I wanted to get to was this part, which is what is it that controls where we put our attention? And you can sort of see, so things that impact where we put our attention, whether it's our attention is largely a visual thing, where we put our where we focus our gaze, but it can be other sensory. It can be where we, what sort of memories we focus on in our working memory. And here are the four things that impact attention, where we put our focus. Sudden motions, mention a name, these are called enduring dispositions. So it's sort of momentary things that happen that change our environment, that change what we're sensing around that. And then there can be attention based on momentary goals. So we put our attention based on things that are happening in the environment, but also based on our goals at the time. So it can be impacted by what's going on around us, or it can be impacted by our goals. And it can be based on what we think is most important at the moment. And then it can also be based on arousal. So it can be based on something happening in the environment. It can be based on our goals. It can be based on the priorities that we have at the time. So if we have multiple goals, then it would be the goals that have the top priority, and it can be based on arousal. And if we are angry at the moment, which would be a form of emotional arousal, that will change what we pay attention to than if we are not angry. It's not necessarily the case that our attention is going to be higher or lower at the time, but where we focus, what sort of attention we give to something will be based on our arousal level at the time. Okay, so I kind of pieced together the different sets of slides that we used here because I wanted to give you sort of a general overview of the different areas that are always concerning when we talk about neuropsychological disorders. Now, for this last part, I have information, but I don't have any slides that have much good detail. So here's what happens. If you look at when you are assessing neuropsychological disorders, you are looking at disorders that impact different areas of cognitive function. We talked in some detail tonight about memory, and we talked about attention. Um, and we talked about learning and memory. Those, well, no, memory, attention, and learning. Those are three areas that are often impacted in neuropsychological disorders. Another area that often is impacted is called abstract thinking. And abstract thinking is the ability to, um, it's the ability to manipulate information in a way that is more complex. Okay, so yeah, I apologize here. I just was pulling up my notes and having a little bit of trouble with them, but I will pull them up here. And so yeah, um, so abstract thinking. So abstract thinking. So learning, memory, attention, abstract thinking. And abstract thinking is the ability to handle information in a more complex ways. It's the ability to conceptualize, generalize, and understand that different concepts can have different meanings in different situations. So abstract thinking is again associated with this higher level of processing that's usually seen uh, in the frontal areas of the brain. Um, and so as the individual develops, as a human being develops, they have the ability to understand things in more complex ways. And that's where this concept of abstract thinking comes from. Now, when you are doing um, neuropsychological assessment, abstract thinking will come from questions like on the mini mental status examination. Um, it Abstract thinking will come from questions like how are an apple and a banana alike, both fruits? How are a train and a bicycle alike, both modes of transportation? So as you move on with abstract thinking, you delve into this testing the person's ability to understand things in more complex ways to take generally with abstract thinking, the idea is that it's the person's ability to take constructs that may seem to have no direct relationship to each other and find how they might be related to each other. So one of the common themes when considering abstract thinking is the ability to take unrelated events, unrelated situations, unrelated constructs, and find some way that they are related. So that is what abstract thinking is about. Now, some other aspects of neuropsychology that come up with neuropsychological disorders would be behavioral initiation. Behavioral initiation is an aspect of neuropsychological functioning that often gets impacted um, from dementia. And what behavioral initiation is the sort of arousal state. It's associated with the same areas of the brain that are associated with arousal when it comes to attention. And behavioral initiation is where the person gets started in doing something. So in sort of the same areas of the brain that impact on the arousal part of attention, they also impact behavioral initiation. And organization is another aspect of neurological functioning, neuropsychological functioning. that relates to the person's ability to basically keep things organized, keeps things in some sort of structured way so that they can be retrieved more readily, so that they can be accessed more readily. So it's interesting. You see how these things are all tied together. That um, attention has a part of it, arousal, so does behavioral initiation. It's the ability for the person to get started. Organization relates to the ability to keep things organized, to keep some things in structure so that they can be recalled better later on. Okay, as we talk more, we've talked about neuropsychological disorders and we will talk more about them, but I wanted you to just have a sense of what the major areas of neuropsychological functioning are. I used a bunch of slides here as I did last week. I will put out an article in a day or two that puts this in better structure, but I wanted to just start to introduce it here uh, so that when we talk about more neuropsychological disorders on Thursday, you'll have sort of a context of what all the areas are that can be impacted by these disorders. I will see all of you on Thursday.